If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales and master detective novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
So on today's episode, Valerie and I look back over season 8 and discuss what we've learnt about cast design and conflict. And we would really love it if you could give our show a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll to the bottom. It's that simple. All right, Valerie, why don't you start us off this week by telling us what your big aha moments have been this season with respect to cast design?
Well, I have to say this was a really interesting area of study for me. Now, obviously, I knew that a supporting cast was there to support the main character. It does what it says on the tin, right? But until I had studied Robert McKee's work, especially his book on character, I'd never really appreciated how much the supporting cast impacted the overall telling of a story or the reader's enjoyment of a story. Now, in terms of cast design, the standout movies for me this season were August Osage County, Sex and the City, and Lady Bird. Although Little Women wasn't bad. In August Osage County, Barbara Fordham is the main character. And what I found most interesting is that the story's antagonist brings out aspects of the main character just as much, or maybe even more, than the rest of the supporting cast. With Sex and the City, I love the idea that Charlotte, Miranda, and Samantha are figments of Carrie's imagination, and that they've been created by Carrie, the writer, for her column as a way of separating herself out into different parts so that she can work through the various issues that she's faced with. Now, that isn't my idea. I found it online. But honestly, it's better than anything I came up with. So I really like that concept for a cast design. Love, Simon, and Lady Bird are interesting to look at together because they're both maturation stories about teenagers who are finding their way in the world. But because Simon is a fairly flat character, not completely flat, but certainly not dimensional in any particularly interesting way, there wasn't much for the supporting cast to do there. And I think that's a really important takeaway. Lady Bird, on the other hand, is multidimensional. And the supporting cast in that movie really helped to bring out her dimensions and helped to bring them to life. And it made for a really interesting movie that I think gets richer with each viewing. Now, it's tempting to think that this idea of a dimensional character, and by extension, a cast that has been designed to bring out aspects of a main character, is only for character-driven or internal genre stories or serious dramas. But nothing could be further from the truth. It also applies to externally driven stories and comedies. And in his book on character, Robert McKee actually does a deep dive into A Fish Called Wanda. So if you're writing a comedy, I really encourage you to get that book and have a read at his analysis. This season, we studied The Full Monty, which is a comedic performance story. And even though Gaz isn't as deep a character as, say, Lady Bird or Barbara Fordham, the supporting cast has indeed been designed to bring out Gaz's characteristics. I found that really interesting. Now, when it comes to August Osage County, which was episode 1 of this season, I think I could have done 10 episodes just on that one movie. It is one of the films that you want to add to your repertoire to study for just about any storytelling principle. And if you're writing a story about a dysfunctional family, well, there's no better masterwork than this one. Melanie, what did you learn?
All right. Well, I love the concept that each character brings out an aspect of the protagonist. The cast of a story, therefore, is a deliberate choice, or who you put in the cast of your story is a deliberate choice. And it depends on how much page time they have as well. So they can't just, the characters can't just wander around and fill space. They have to be there for a purpose. And I really enjoyed exploring that or watching you explore that this season. So the concept, though, that I've used in the past, instead of the solar system that you've talked about this season, the way that I have it in my head is that there's points on a compass with the protagonist in the center, and the supporting characters are at points of the compass with a bit of a description on what it is that they bring out or what aspects of the protagonist character they represent. And it's just a slightly different way of looking at it, but it's still, I think, the same in theory. It's the same principle in theory as what you've been talking about with McKee. But the thing that I find the most fascinating about this is, and the character dimensions that you've talked about this season, is that it's reflective of what happens in real life. Different people bring out different aspects of our personalities, and sometimes that can be surprising, and other times we know how we're going to behave and think. For example, we may behave one way around family compared to a different way we behave when we're at work. And I find that really fascinating. I find that fascinating about people in general. But it seems to be lost a little bit, I think, that we as people are so multidimensional, and that our characters, therefore, in our stories also need to be multidimensional and reflect people in real life, even if they're fictional characters. So this season, there were some movies that didn't demand a great deal of emotional complexity from the protagonist. So the cast design was based very much on creating external conflict and external chaos for the protagonists. So the examples of that this season were The Gentleman and No Way Out. And then there were also other movies I felt a bit disappointed with when it came to the cast design. So the cast weren't given roles that really emphasised the protagonist's character dimension, and they didn't create conflict in the protagonist either. And I think the examples, like you mentioned, Valerie, one was particularly Love, Simon. And for me, the first half of Little Women, that was an example where the cast design, I think, could have been improved, or the actions of the cast could have created a bit more conflict and tension for the protagonists. But as I've listened to you this season, and as I've mentioned just before, it's occurred to me that to make our characters appear more human, they must have complexity just like humans do. And most people that I know, including myself, are mixed bags of emotions, beliefs and actions and reactions. And I also know that McKee calls the conflicting character traits in characters dimensions, but I make sense of that in a slightly different way. I see it as contradictions, and that makes sense for me to call it contradictions as opposed to dimensions, but it's the same thing. And the best examples, I think, of characters who were as close to humans as possible were Lady Bird and Barbara from August, Osage County. And I'm going to say this, and I know you're going to disagree with me. And I also think that Lita from The Lost Daughter was quite conflicted and full of contradictions. So these were movies, I think, where strong character arcs, or there were strong character arcs. So it made sense that they would have, those characters would have more dimensions. All of those movies, I think, had interesting casts that drew out different aspects of the main characters' personalities. But some protagonists don't need many dimensions because of the genre, but they do need large and varied characters in the cast. And when I say this, I'm thinking about serial action stories and crime stories. Good examples of those characters that don't need much dimension are Hercule Poirot, James Bond, and Temperance Brennan. And this is They're stories where the actual conflict is more about the external events than it is about the change in the protagonist. So the casts are there to create the external conflict for the protagonists, as opposed to the more complex characters required for stories that involve internal conflict and maturation arcs. And I know I'm talking about conflict there, but I do mean that in terms of the character traits that they bring out in each other as you're designing that cast. Now, the films, I think, this season that had reasonable cast design, such as Sex and the City and The Woman King, they were okay, but they had other fundamental storytelling principles that didn't work. So in these movies, in my opinion, they weren't as satisfying as August, Osage County, and Lady Bird. So the biggest takeaway for me this season, as we've looked at cast design, was that you have to be conscious of designing the cast, and the more variety in the cast, as long as it's supportive of the themes, the more opportunity you have to create contradictions and conflict with the protagonist. So what would be your biggest takeaway for us this season in regards to cast design?
Well, my best piece of advice here's the thing. We've got to take the time to really get to know who our main character is and what her dimensions are. And dimensions, again, are sets of conflicting traits. And once we know that, then we can create a cast of characters to bring out those aspects of the character's personality. So let me just repeat what I stated in episode 1. The idea behind cast design is that every character in your story exists to bring out an aspect of your protagonist. In other words, your main character develops because of her interaction with other characters. Therefore, when we talk about character development, what we're talking about is how a protagonist changes from the beginning of a story to the end as a result of the interactions she's had with other characters in the story. So, when we think about cast design, we need to know who our protagonist is at the beginning of our story and who she'll be at the end. And then we need to create a cast of supporting characters that will make this transition possible. Okay, Melanie, you studied conflict this season. So, what did you discover?
All right, well, I don't think I've done this topic or the topic of conflict justice this season, because there is more to this topic than I anticipated. And I haven't covered everything that I've wanted to be honest. I've also realised that I have spent the last few seasons studying topics related to conflict, but in the wrong order. So I think that I should have studied conflict first, and then in order, I should have looked at forces of antagonism, stakes. And, Valerie and I, we've both commented on the show and in our offline conversations that at some point we really need to do objects of desire. But hindsight is a wonderful thing. Now, this season, I have used Janice Hardy's book, Understanding Conflict, and what it really means as the basis for my study. In particular, I like the following explanation of conflict that Hardy uses. And I quote, "Conflict is a complex blend of wants and needs, stakes, antagonism, and the protagonist's inner struggle. Conflict in a story comes from more than one thing," unquote. And the reason that I like this is because I think that conflict is misunderstood. So, for example, I've often heard people say that, story is conflict. But I've discovered that this is only half the truth. Conflict is important, but you can have conflict without a story. Watching a boxing match is a great example of physical conflict, but again, there isn't necessarily a story about that. So a better way to describe a story, and this is something that I've learnt and reinforced this season, is that a story is about a character's struggle to solve problems that are standing in the way of achieving their goal. And to me, that is a better description than story is conflict. Now, this season, I've examined the differences between external conflict, internal conflict, and character arc. Now, these are often referred to as the layers of conflict. And as writers, we need to understand how those layers work together and how to use them. So, external conflict creates physical challenges and external obstacles in the plot. And this is the situation in a story that must be resolved. So, external conflict drives the plot. The internal conflict is the emotional conflict. It's the struggle to make the right choice. So, internal conflict originates from the protagonist's internal value system and the beliefs the protagonist has about herself. However, internal conflict isn't the same as character arc. A character can have internal conflict without a character arc. And character arc is about the change in the protagonist's character. And what I mean by that is it is a change in the way the protagonist thinks and therefore the way that they act compared from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. Now, we saw examples this season where characters had internal conflict, but it didn't translate into a change in the character's thoughts or actions. So Mickey in The Gentleman doesn't change the way he thinks and then acts. And in my opinion, neither does Gaz in The Full Monty. But both of these characters had internal conflicts. Gaz's internal conflict is about losing his son Nathan, and Mickey's is about whether or not to sell his business. But neither changes the way they think or act by the end of the movie. Even in these stories, though, the external conflict triggers the internal conflict. The other concept that I've learnt about this season that comes from the study of conflict is about the concept of tension. And Janice Hardy says, and I quote, that conflict relies on tension to make readers want to know what happens, unquote. Tension is built by the expectation that something is going to happen. It's reader anticipation and the searching for the answers to a question. So when someone gives you feedback like there's no conflict in your story, what they may mean is that there's no tension. So a good example of tension building for me this season was in The Lost Daughter. So the arrival of the large Queen's family at the resort made me think there's something that's going to happen. What is going to happen? There's tension building there. There's a point for conflict. And those characters or in that family were very menacing, and their presence for me created tension because, again, as I said, there was a feeling that something was going to happen to Lita or one of the members of the family, especially after Lita took the doll. The disappointing thing was that the tension didn't necessarily lead to anything, which was disappointing. But for me, there was a feeling of tension that something was going to happen after that family arrived in that movie. Now, there's also core conflict, which is the main problem at the centre of a story. And this is what the story is about. And it is the conflict there that creates the plot. So resolving the core conflict becomes the purpose or is the purpose of a story. Now, that's the types of conflict, roughly, that I've covered off this season, as well as character arcs and tension. But I've also learnt a lot this season about what conflict isn't. And conflict isn't tension, so it's not fighting, and it's not always what's in the way of the protagonist. So there is so much to learn about conflict. And like I said before, I don't think I've given it much, I don't think I've done it justice. But Valerie, what did you learn about conflict this season?
Well, conflict is the stuff that stories are made of. If your story doesn't have conflict, it's not working. And Melanie, you and I keep talking about the object of desire, right? We've already mentioned that. I don't know if it's come up in every episode, but it's coming up. It has come up in a lot of them. And when it comes to conflict, knowing the protagonist's object of desire is essential. So it's no surprise that movies that had better conflict were the more interesting stories. And again, I'm putting August Osage County right at the top of the heap this week. In terms of your study this season, the work you did on No Way Out was really interesting. You talked about conflict triangles between characters, and this actually goes hand in glove with cast design. Although I really didn't get into it too much this season because there's only so much time. I focused on members of the supporting cast and their role in highlighting an aspect of the protagonist character. So each member of the supporting cast has a relationship to the main character, but they also have relationships to one another. And this is where the conflict triangles pop up. And the more connections we can make between our characters, the more conflict triangles we're going to have, and the more interesting the story is going to be. So it really creates narrative drive. And you just talked about this. Tension, right? It's creating tension. So for anyone who hasn't listened to the episode on No Way Out, I highly recommend you go back and give it a listen and watch the movie. It's an oldie, but a goodie. It's an oldie anyway. So in terms of your study of conflict this season, No Way Out's the standout film because you showed the connection between plot and character in a way that is not only an interesting bit of theory, but it's really useful. And I'm a pragmatist. I'm all about it being useful. So let me ask you this now. In all the work that you've done over the past 10 episodes, what is the one piece of advice that you'd like to leave listeners with?
Well, in summary, my best advice for authors and the most important takeaways from this season's topics is that I have 3 takeaways, but I'll summarize them very quickly. So first of all, examine the problems that you may be having in your manuscript by asking the questions. What does the protagonist want and need? So what is their object of desire? What are the forces of antagonism or the obstacles stopping them? And what's at stake if they don't get what they want or if they do get what they want? Answering these questions will help you identify problems in your stories at the scene, sequence, act, and story level. And more importantly, once you've identified those problems, you'll be able to fix them. Now, my second point is that I list ways to fix conflict problems in episode 7 in Sex and the City. So I won't go through them all now, but I refer you back to that episode if you want to understand some ways to fix conflict problems. And finally, the third thing that I would really like you to take away, and as Valerie mentioned, using conflict triangles at all levels of a story can give you a quick and relatively easy way to create and maintain conflict between characters. The basic idea is that 3 people in a scene have opposing wants, stakes, and they are all each other's antagonists. Use multiple conflict triangles throughout your story and all centered around the core conflict. This will give you options and make you think about the cast you create for your protagonist to interact with.
Alrighty, coming up next season, season 9, we're going to do things a little differently. A few episodes ago, I referenced something that I call left-brain stories. In other words, they're stories that are mostly about solving a puzzle of some kind. They're stories that appeal more to our logical mind than our emotional heart. Now, they tend to be mysteries and some spy and espionage stories and some thrillers. But they can certainly appear in other genres as well. So, Melanie, when it comes to left brain stories, what will your focus of study be next season?
All right, so next season, I'm going to focus on the types of clues in these stories and also tracking the antagonist through the story. I find that really fascinating. So be prepared for detail.
So you're going micro, I'm going to go macro, and I'm going to focus on storytelling fundamentals because I want to see where left brain stories are the same as other stories and where they're different. I think it's going to be a really interesting season. I can't wait for next week.
No, me neither. I'm really looking forward to it. My detailed weevil is going to come out. All right, so that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss Crooked House. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For access to writing templates and worksheets and more than 70 hours of training, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. And if you'd like to find out about books to help you read like a writer, visit me on Facebook and Instagram under Melanie Hill Author, or find out more about me at melaniehill.com.au. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.